السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله الذي جعل للعلم أصولا وسهل بها إليه وصولا، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل وسلم على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. All praise and thanks are due to Allah, the one who made for knowledge foundations, and through them facilitated its attainment and preservation. And I bear witness that none has the right to be worshipped except for Allah alone with no partner. And I bear witness that Muhammad is his servant and messenger. May the salawat and salam of Allah be upon him, his household, his companions, and those that follow them in righteousness. This is the 8th sitting in understanding an introduction or a small introduction to fiqh. And we had previously stopped at the end of the section of Salah and the start of the section regarding the pillars of Salah, its obligations and sunan aspects. Now.
فصل في أركان الصلاة وواجباتها وسننها. The statements and actions of Salah are in 3 categories. The first, those which nullify the Salah if they are left out, whether on purpose or forgetfully. These are the arkan. The second, those which nullify the Salah if they are left out on purpose, not forgetfully. These are the wajibat. The third, those which do not nullify the Salah regardless if left out on purpose or forgetfully. These are the sunan. The arkan of Salah are 14. The first, standing if capable in the thought. The second, the opening takbir al-ihram, and saying it and all other rukn and wajib openly to the extent that the person lets himself hear himself in a must. But the third, the reading of the Fatiha. The fourth, bowing al-ruku'. The fifth, rising from it. The sixth, straining up from it fully. The seventh, prostrating as sujood. The eighth, rising from it. The ninth, sitting between 2 prostrations. The 10th, tranquility. Al-tamannina. The 11th, the last tashahud. The portion of it which is rukn is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, after having fulfilled the first part of the tashahud. The minimum amount for fulfilling it is at-tahiyatu lillah, salamu alayka ayyuha an-nabiy wa rahmatullah, salamu alayna wa ala ibadillahi as-salihin, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan rasulullah. The 12th, sitting for it and for the taslimatain. The 13th, the taslimatain. That is that the person says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and it is enough in the nafil and the janaiz 1 taslim. The 14th sequence at-tafdeeb between the arkan. The wajibat are 8. The first, takbir al-intiqal. The second, the statement Sami Allahu liman hamida, for the imam and for the munfarid.
For the imam, the one being led, and the munfarid. For the imam, the one being led, the ma'moon, and the munfarid, the one praying by himself.
The third, the statement Rabbana wa lakal hamd, for the imam, the one being led, and the munfarid. The fourth, the statement Subhana Rabbi al-Azim in the ruku'. The fifth, the statement Subhana Rabbi al-A'la in sujood. The sixth, the statement Rabbi al-Qibli between the 2 sajdas. The seventh, the tashahud al-awwal. The eighth, sitting for it. As for the sunan, then it compromises what remains of the salah's description.
The author began a new section out of the sections of this book, and he entitled it a section with regards to the pillars, the arkan of Salah, which we have translated previously as being the essential components, وواجباتها, and its obligations, وَسُنَنِهَا, and its complementary aspects or the sunan aspects. And he mentioned herein three main issues. He mentions herein, in this section, three main issues. The first, clarifying that the salah consists of, or the statements and actions of the salah are of three categories. The statements and actions of salah are of three categories. And he mentioned those three categories as being: number one, that which the salah becomes nullified if the person leaves it off amdan, on purpose, or sahwan, or forgetfully, mistakenly. And these actions are labeled arkan. So if they are left off by a person, anything which is considered to be a rukn or a pillar, if a person leaves that action off on purpose or due to forgetfulness, then the salah will be null and void. The second type of statement or action for the salah are those statements or actions which, if left on purpose, render the salah invalid, but if left out by accident, do not render the salah invalid. And these actions and statements are labeled as being wajibat. So if a person leaves any of the wajibat on purpose, then the salah is null and void. But if a person leaves them off forgetfully, accidentally, then they can be made up. The salah can be rescued, can be patched up. And that is through the prayer or through the addition of sujood as-sahw. And that patching up of the salah will be through sujood as-sahw, which we'll discuss in one of the coming sections. The third type of statement or action are those statements or actions which do not nullify the salah unrestrictedly, i.e. whether left off on purpose or by accident, either way, unrestrictedly, they do not nullify the salah. And these statements or actions are referred to as sunan. Sunan. The second main issue that the author mentioned is clarifying the arkan or the pillars of the salah. We said the pillars of the salah, if a person leaves them off on purpose or forgetfully, the salah is nullified. And he clarified that the pillars of the salah, the essential components, the things that hold the salah up, are 14 in number. They are 14 in number. And we have previously mentioned the importance of, or the benefit of, numbering things. Because even if a person doesn't remember all 14, if he or she remembers there are 14, then he knows how many he or she is missing. But if you don't number things, you might mention 10 and think you have all of them. The first one the author mentioned as being standing in a fard prayer مع القدرة, with the ability. Standing if capable in the fard. So he has qualified this pillar as being in the fard. What does that exclude? then it's not a pillar in the sunan or the nawafil. Yeah. So when he mentions fard, there's a reason, because in the sunan it is not a pillar. The second pillar that he mentions is takbiratul ihram. Takbiratul ihram. The takbir which makes things that are normally halal haram, i.e. the opening takbir that a person says, which enters a person into the salah. So this is the statement, Allahu Akbar. And he mentioned herein that the person has to say it loud, has to say it out loud. Whenever we mentioned that a person has to say something, the person, as he says here, and he saying it, and all other rukn and wajibat, is to say it openly. To what extent? To the extent that the person can hear himself. Allahu Akbar. I.e., it's not that the person is saying it in his mind without moving his lips and tongue. So it is a must that a person says these adhkar that are going to be mentioned, the takbiratul ihram, alaykum salam, the takbiratul ihram, and other than that, to the extent that he can hear himself. And the movement, at least, there has to be at least a movement of the mouth, the parts that are needed for that statement. If a person does not move any of those limbs that he needs for that particular statement, then he would not have come with that rukn or that wajib. The third from the 14 pillars that the author mentions is reading of Fatiha. The fourth, al-ruku'. The fifth, raising from it. And as we mentioned, generally speaking, the discussion here is with regards to general prayers in general. But there are some prayers that are different to others, and they take exceptions. For example, the prayer of janazah. Likewise, the prayer when the eclipse happens, which has a different number of, yes. The sixth, al-i'tidal, raising from it. Standing up, straightening oneself up from it. The seventh, sujood. The eighth, raising from the sujood. The ninth, sitting between the two sajdatain. The 10th, at-tama'nina or at-tama'nina, and that is translated here as being tranquility. Tranquility. And some of the scholars explain that as being that the person at least can say the dhikr that is in that place at least once. So if he's in ruku', at least he has ruku' long enough that he can or she can say the dhikr that is mentioned for that particular station. Then the author mentions the final tashahhud. The final tashahhud. Number 11, the final tashahhud. And he says the portion of it which is a rukn is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And the more correct opinion, Shaykh Salih mentions, is that what is sufficient as a rukn, i.e. the minimum that a person has to say, is at least one of the things that has come from the Prophet ﷺ. One of the things as has come from the Prophet ﷺ. When does he say that? After he has made the first part of at-tahiyyat. So some of the scholars say, if a person says Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, then that is enough as a rukn. He has done salawat upon the Prophet ﷺ. But the more correct opinion that the Shaykh mentions here in his explanation is that what is sufficient is that the person at least comes with one of the portions of what the Prophet ﷺ instructed the companions to do. What time is that? 28. Oh. Huh? 28. The 12th rukun, al-julus, sitting for it. Sitting for it. And for the 2 taslims. Sitting for the sending salawat upon the Prophet ﷺ and the tashahhud, and sitting for the 2 taslims. And the 13th pillar is the taslimatan, the 2 taslims. And that is that the person says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And it is enough, the scholar says here, and it is enough in the nafl and the janaiz to say 1 taslim. And the more correct opinion is that 1 taslim is enough. So 1 salam is enough as a pillar. So if a person gives salam in a normal salah, in the fard salah or in the sunnah salah, and he does it to one side, to the right, then that first taslim is the pillar, and the second one will be a sunnah. Then the author mentioned the 14th, which is the sequence at-tartib bayn al-arkan, the sequence between all of these pillars, i.e. that it is done in sequential order. The author hafidhahullah ta'ala then went on to mention the 3rd main point in this section, and that is the part wherein he mentions the wajibat of salah. And we said the wajibat are those statements or actions that if left on purpose nullify the salah, and if left by accident the salah can be rectified or made up, and is made up by sujood as-sahw. Okay, sujood as-sahw. And he mentioned here that they are 8 things. They are 8 things. The first, takbir al-intiqal. Al-intiqal means movement. And these are all the takbirs other than the takbirat al-ihram. These are all the takbirs other than the takbirat al-ihram. And the movement here is between the pillars. So the person makes the takbir between the 2 pillars that he is. So for example, he is going from the standing to the ruku'. He makes the takbir as he is moving, not before he moves and not after he's finished moving. They are in between. And then same thing for the sujood and so forth. So those takbirat are wajib, and the takbiratul ihram is a pillar, and that is the takbir that the person says to enter the salah. The second wajib that the author mentions is the statement Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah. The third obligatory aspect is the statement Rabbana walakal hamd. Okay, in your notes correct this inshallah, and it needs to be corrected on the screen. That is point number 2. The second wajib is the statement Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah for the imam and the munfarid. That is what is in the book, for the imam and the munfarid. And the more correct opinion is that it's for the imam, the munfarid and the ma'moom. And Allah knows best. Then number 3, the statement رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدِ for the Imam, the Ma'moom and the Munfarid. For the Imam, the one being led, and the one praying by himself. So the third statement, رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدِ for the Imam and the Munfarid, and it's supposed to say here, the Imam, the one being led, and the Munfarid. So the scholars that mention that the second statement is for the Imam and the one praying by himself, ay Sami Allahu liman hamida. Some scholars, they would say that that is for the Imam and the person praying by himself. The person that is being led, he will not need to say that. And they will say that they say this as they are rising, Sami Allahu liman hamida. So they are on ruku', as they are rising, Sami Allahu liman hamida. When they've straightened up, Rabbana wa lakal hamd. And the third statement, or the third wajib, the Imam and the Munfarid, they'll say it once they're raised up. And the person being led, he says it as he is raising up. That's according if you go to that view. But the more correct view is that the person says it once he stood up as well. Because he's going to say Rabbana wa lakal hamd as he's Sami Allahu liman hamid as he's rising. And once he stood straight, Rabbana wa lakal hamd. Then the author mentions the fourth wajib out of the 8, which is the statement Subhana Rabbiyal Azim in the ruku'. And the fifth obligatory the fifth obligatory point is the statement Subhana Rabbiyal A'la in the sujood. The sixth point, obligatory point, is the statement Rabbi ghfirli in between the two sujoods, between the two sajdas. The seventh obligatory point is the first tashahhud. The first tashahhud meaning in the second rak'ah. Yes? Except for Fajr or two rak'ah prayers, yeah? And the eighth obligatory point is sitting for that tashahhud. Alaykum as-salam wa rahmatullah. So if a person is praying at 2 rak'ah prayers, like Fajr, his first tashahhud is also his last. So it will be a rukn. But if he's praying, for example, Dhuhr, the second rak'ah, he do tashahhud, and that will be the first. And the fourth rak'ah, he do another one, that's the last one. That's the rukn, the last one. The second rak'ah, that will be an obligation. And then the author finishes this section off by saying that as for the sunan, and we said the sunnah, what was the ruling for them? There are those things, statements and actions which do not nullify the salah unrestrictedly. I.e., whether left on purpose or whether they were left off by accident, they don't nullify the salah, the person leaving it. Of course, the reward will not be the same. And they are whatever is left off that comprises the salah. I.e., anything else that is found in the salah that doesn't fall under these two categories, then it's a sunnah. Reading a surah after Surah Al-Fatiha. Okay, we stop there and we continue the next section after the salah. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Now, the new section.
The timing of Salah Dhuhr is from the declining of the sun. Zawal al-Shams, i.e., it's moving from the middle of the sky in the day until the shadow of an object is the same as the size of the object after the shadow of Zawal.
Until the shadow of an object is the same size as the object after the shadow of Zawal.
It is followed by the time of Salah, al-Asr, which is from the ending of the time of Dhuhr until the shadow of an object is twice its size after the shadow of Zawal. This is the ending of the normal Asr time. What follows that time is time for necessity until the setting of the sun. It is followed by the time of Salah al-Maghrib, which is from the setting of the sun until the disappearing of the red light. It is followed by the preferred time for Salatul Isha until the first third of the night. Then it is a time for necessity until the Tulu of Al-Fajr Al-Thani, which is the
Bayad Al-Mu'tarid Bil-Mashriq.
And then there is no darkness after it. It is followed by the timing of Fajr, which is from Tulu of Al-Fajr Al-Thani until the Shuruq of the Shams.
The author, Hafidhahullah, started a new section from the sections of the book, and he entitled it section with regards to the mawaqit of as-salah. And this word, when we hear the word mawaqit in regards to the books of fiqh, sometimes refers to certain places or to certain times. As for the places with regards to salah, so here in this section is talking about the timings, because the places for salah is every place except for a few which have been exempted from it. But when you come to mawaqit of Hajj, for example, or Umrah, you will find that it's talking about places and timings. So here the author is not talking about the places, but he's talking about the timings of the salawat. And he mentioned within it the five major points. He began by mentioning, or the first of those points is the author clarifying the timing of Salah al-Dhuhr, wherein he said that the timing of Salah al-Dhuhr is from the declining of the sun, the zawal of the shams. And he explained that as being it's moving from the middle of the sky towards the west. So from what we perceive, from what we see that the sun rises from the east and goes towards the zenith, to the middle of the sky. When it reaches the absolute middle, that is the zenith, and then it starts to decline. This is called zawal, and it declines towards the west. So the zenith is when it's in the middle, right in the middle part, and then when it starts to decline, from that start of the declining, that's when the start of dhuhr starts. And then he says that's the start of dhuhr, and then it says until the shadow, i.e. dhuhr, is still in, until the shadow of an object is the same size as the object. Let's understand that first. So if you were to put something into the ground, if you were to stick something into the ground, the sun would rise, so there will be a shadow on this side. Okay? The sun would put a shadow that way. Then when it gets to the top, there will be a very small shadow, or either no shadow at all, there will be a small shadow when it's at the zenith. Then when it starts to move, dhuhr started, so there will be a shadow on this side. Dhuhr started. When the shadow is the same size as this object that is causing the shadow, then dhuhr will end. That's the normal, what you normally hear. Yeah. So if this is 1 meter, then the shadow would have to be 1 meter. then Dhuhr will end. But here the Shaykh says, after the shadow of Zawal. What that means is, when the sun is right on top of the object, there should be no shadow, or very minimal. When it moves a little bit, that's when Zawal starts. So it'll be a small shadow. So if this was, for example, a meter, there might be 10 centimeters. It'll be a small shadow. This is called the shadow of Zawal. The shadow of when the sun first moves a little bit, when Zawal starts. Let's say it's 10 centimeters. So the end of Dhuhr will be when the sun has moved and the shadow is the same as the object, which was what? 1 meter. Plus after the shadow of Zawal. So how long should it be? 1 meter and the 10 centimeters, for example. Yeah? So here's this statement, after the shadow of Zawal. Highlight it and make sure you understand what it means. So if the shadow of Zawal is 10 centimeters, then Dhuhr will finish when the shadow is the same as the object plus that 10 centimeters, the shadow of Zawal. Normally the way I learnt it, and the way some scholars explain it, is that when it's the same size, that's it. 1 meter, then Dhuhr is finished. But when you see some books, they will say after the shadow of Zawal. So 1 meter plus that shadow that was initial at Zawal time, 10 centimeters and so forth. The shadow of Zawal, so if you have this object here, when the sun is here, is the shadow going to be the same length? No, it will be small, isn't it? Because it's right on top. So let's say that's 10 centimeters. That shadow is called shadow of Zawal. That's 10 centimeters. Now, when we say the shadow now comes to here, if we say it's the same as the object, it will be 1 meter. But if we say the same as the object plus the shadow of Zawal, which was 10 centimeters, what would it be? 1 meter and 10. That's what it means there. So whenever you see this sentence in the books of the scholars, that's what they mean. They mean you add the object size and the size of the shadow of Zawal. Yeah? With me? Half and half. Okay, half and half is good. Because we've never experienced it. In the first lesson we mentioned that some of these things we never paid attention to it. So it's a bit difficult to grasp it. So we're gonna, especially when we talk about Fajr al-Thani, al-Fajr al-Sadiq, we're going to mention that again, inshallah. Okay. Then the author, rahimahullah, hafidhahullah, went on to mention, so that's with regards to Dhuhr. There are two things involved: the shadow of the object and the shadow that was the object at the time of Zawal. Two things. Okay. The second thing that the author mentions, or the second point that the author mentioned, is the timing of Asr. And he said that Asr timing starts when Dhuhr ends. So as soon as Dhuhr finishes, Asr begins. There's no gap in between them. So that means when the object is the same, with the shadow is the same as the object prior to Zawal, or Dhuhr ends and Asr begins. And Asr remains or stays until the shadow of an object is the same or is twice the shadow of an object is twice the length of the object. So if we said 1 meter, 2 meters and 10 centimeters. So after the shadow of the object is twice plus the Zawal. The Zawal we said, for example, 10 centimeters. So it'll be 2 meters and 10 centimeters. That's when Asr will finish. But he says here, that's when the time of normal Asr will finish. Normally, the person should pray Asr by that time. What follows that time, what we just mentioned. So this is called the waqt of Asr, which is, you could say, mukhtar. You have ikhtiyar, you have a choice to pray at that time. From between those two times, the end of Dhuhr until the object is twice the length plus Zawal. This you have option, you can pray any of that time. So when the shadow is twice the object and Zawal, then the end of Asr, optional Asr you can say, where you have an option to pray Asr between the end of Dhuhr and that time. you can pray anytime. From that time, when the shadow of the object is twice and zawal, from that time until just before the sunset is the time of Asr, which is for those people that have an excuse of necessity, for durura. So for example, a person is very busy, he's rushing around, so he prays, he has a reason to delay until that time. But a person who is just sitting relaxing, he can't delay until that time. Dhuhr starts when the sun moves from the zenith, it starts to decline. Are you with me? It ends when the shadow of an object is the same size plus zawal, the shadow of zawal. So when that comes, Asr starts. Dhuhr ends and Asr starts straight away. Asr, you have an option to pray Asr until the shadow of the object is twice the length of the object. So if the object is 1 meter, the shadow is 2 meters plus the shadow of zawal, the 10 centimeters. Then you can pray Asr between that time and that time. That time there, so between Dhuhr, the end of Dhuhr, and that time we just mentioned now, is where you have an option to pray Asr. From that time, when the option finishes, until just before Maghrib, when the sun sets, is waqt of Asr for necessity. You have an exception, there's a reason, you had to delay Asr until that time. But normally, if you just sitting at home, you got option, you don't leave Asr until then. So for Asr we mentioned 2 times. The optional time, when we have the time to pray it, and we mentioned the time for people that have excuse. Okay. Then the author mentions the time of Maghrib, and he says it is from the setting of the sun. From the setting of the sun, when the sun has set, all of the disk has set. Yes? Until the red bits of the sky have gone dark. There's darkness. You can't see any more of those red things in the sky. And this disappearing of the red light. Yes, the disk of the sun has gone. You can't see the disk of the sun. Then the author mentioned the 4th point, which is, he mentions the preferred time for Salah, Al-Isha. And he mentions here that it is until the 1st third of the night. After Maghrib has finished, which was when? Good. Then until the 1st third of the night. But the correct opinion, and he says until the 1st third of the night is the optional, and until Fajr starts is for necessity. But the more correct opinion, the Shaykh Salih mentions, is that Isha begins with the end of Maghrib and it ends in the half, nisful layl, the half of the night. The half of the night. Half of the night doesn't mean midnight. You calculate half of the night from when Maghrib starts until Fajr starts. So from Maghrib starting until Fajr starting, that's called night. So the middle of that timing. So whatever that time is, you look at the middle between. So Isha will be from the end of Maghrib until that middle of the night, but not midnight. I'm going to mention some points at the end to clarify some of these issues, because some of these things for us may not apply totally. And the optional time, that was the optional time. And if a person has a necessity, he can pray until before Fajr starts. If there is a necessity, the person can pray the Isha until Fajr starts. And he explained here, when he says Al-Fajr al-Thani, sometimes when we talk about the timing of Fajr, you'll find the scholars mention two timings. Fajr al-Kadhib, if I remember correctly, and Fajr al-Sadiq, or Fajr al-Thani. So you can say the fake Fajr, or the incorrect Fajr, and the Fajr which is the second Fajr, or the correct Fajr. And he explained, how can you know? He says the second Fajr is that which has a bright light, or the white light, which is across the horizon. Whereas so there's going to be two things he's going to mention, then I'll mention the other one. So the second Fajr, it has a bright light, or a light, white light across, is mu'tarid, is spread out by what you can see, i.e. where the sun comes from. Mashriq is where the east, where the sun is coming. And there is no darkness after it, i.e. when that starts, after that you won't see darkness. Whereas the first Fajr, you will see that the light is more vertical. The first Fajr, I remember Shaykh Abdul Razak, he had slides, and he showed us the slides. But it was a depiction, it wasn't a picture, but how it looks more vertical, and the other one is horizontal. That's the lighting. And then he says, the author Hafidhullah mentions, it is followed by the timing of Fajr, i.e. Isha is followed by the timing of Fajr, which is from the tulu', from the coming out of the second Fajr, until the shuruq, until the sun rises. Now a couple of points here with regards to these timings. Now most of us are familiar with the timetables. And if someone starts to discuss the timetables, then look to the person. Is he someone whose knowledge you trust? Someone whose religion you trust? Don't just every time someone talks, you say, oh, I'm confused now. I don't know. I'm not sure if I can pray Fajr at this time. Can I pray in this masjid, that masjid? Don't lend your ear to just any person. And look especially to those people that are older and senior in knowledge and age. The reason I say that is because all the time you're going to find someone that's going to say something. And if every time you listen to people, you're going to spend a lot of time doing things that you're going to just be not doing anything. One day you hear this person say this, that person he said that, and so forth. That's number one. Number two, we mentioned at the start of these lessons that when it comes to fiqh, the first step is to try to understand the mas'ala, try to understand the picture, even before you ask for the ruling. Because if you have a ruling, someone says, oh, this is wajib, or this is haram, and you don't even understand what it is, you don't even know if you're doing it or not. You might think you're doing something wajib and you're not doing it because you've misunderstood what the topic is. And when we mentioned that, we said that some issues like this one, most of us being people that live in cities that don't see the skies unless there is, and except when there is a light, there's a street light. If the street light on the road goes out, we think, whoa, it's so dark, because we're not used to it. We always used to seeing lights. So even when we look up the sky, we struggle to distinguish between the light which is from the sky and the light which is from the street light. For us, people like that, we're going to struggle to know these things. It's like a different world for us. Yeah, that's why when you go back home, if you have a back home, and you look at the sky and you see stars, you're amazed. Yeah, because it looks totally different. And it's one of the sheikhs that I was listening to talking about this topic. He says people that are living in cities don't really know these things. And he says what shows you that, the reality of that, is if you look in Ramadan, and I laugh because this is true. The last 10 nights, almost every night, someone sends you a picture and says, oh, last night the sun was like Laylatul Qadr. Almost every day, someone will send you a different picture. One person one day, the next day in another group, someone else says, oh, look, I took a picture, guys. Last night was Laylatul Qadr, because exactly it fits the description. The next day, somebody else says the same thing about a different night. Why? Because we don't know. We just, oh, it looks, maybe it's like this. And we see what we want to see, because we're not used to it. Okay? Whereas people that live that type of lifestyle, where they've grown up with their fathers, they see the new moon. Like now, sometimes people say, I saw the moon. And maybe they saw Saturn. But because we're not used to it, we just say, oh, there's a new moon. But we're not familiar with it. But people that grew up seeing that their fathers used to go out and look, and they were with their fathers looking. Or the people in the community used to go out and look for the new moon. Or the people, they live in the desert and they used to put things up like this and say, okay, now is the time is there. If you look online, you will see some people in their masjid, they will have a little rock, some little dome thing, and they'll look and see, oh, the sun has moved like this. And they can tell straight away. Yeah? Because that's what they grow up with. But if now we haven't grown up like that, and we want to go out and, you know, to the borough, to the end of the borough, where the farms begin, and we say, oh, yesterday we went to sight the moon. Or we looked at what time Fajr comes in. And you've never done it before. Or you've just done it, everyone's DIY. That's not appropriate. That's not correct. And last thing, that there may be some places on earth where the light, if you look at the sky, the redness doesn't go in some times of the year. That's why sometimes when you ask me some of these questions, it may not apply here because of whichever way the planet is and however it is. So if you look at sometimes in the middle of the summer, you'll see that there's always some light in the sky. And it's not from the lights, it's actually this light. In that situation, go back to the students or the students of knowledge that you know, who's, alhamdulillah, now 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they've been coming back, grey beards, mature, they're not hasty, you trust their knowledge, they're mature people. Go and ask them. See what they say. Don't go to someone, and I'm not saying you cannot learn from someone who's just come back, but normally people that just come back from learning, they're still passionate, they haven't experienced life as much. So they'll say, no, it's like this and that and that. And if you go to somebody else who's studied in the same place, who's been having more experience, he's more senior, and lives in the same country, you ask him, and you see the answer that he gives you is more calm. Okay? Same is not because he is perfect or he is like, oh, he's a genius, but experience sometimes helps you to know how to implement knowledge. And that's with many topics. Even look at yourself. When you first started practicing, maybe you're very tough about certain topics. Oh, why people like this? Oh, this. After 5 years, I hope you've matured a bit. Yes? You're not as, if you see someone, you may still think he is wrong, but you understand there's hikmah to how to deal with it. There's a reality to it. It's not just, you just think, oh, I'm going to give da'wah and tomorrow he will change. You have to understand how the situation is. You understand that there is hikmah that is involved. And you look, not just because you think it's hikmah, but you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ. You see how he changed the people. There was hikmah in how he done things. So likewise, when we talk about these big issues, how when a person starts fasting, when a person finishes their fast, when a person prays their prayer, you have to be careful. Don't just ask someone who is just young, he just graduated yesterday, he just started learning yesterday, and you ask him big issues. Issues that in the house, can cause problems. The father is arguing with the son because the son is saying, no, you guys are not fasting anymore because you're eating at the wrong time. You're having suhoor too late, or whatever the case may be. Or I'm not going to pray in the masjid anymore. The young man stops praying in the masjid. He says they pray at the wrong time. So the first month he prays at home. Second month he starts to miss the prayer. Third month he prays Fajr at Dhuhr. Why? Because of someone that gives an answer that didn't take everything into consideration. So be careful and be careful. This is just this what we're covering here is the beginning of the beginning. As long as you're studying your deen in English and you can't do the Arabic. Okay, you can use English as a crutch sometimes, but if your primary studies are in English, you're a beginner, total beginner of a beginner. Once you start to study in Arabic, the proper books in Arabic, then you're a beginner. Then we are beginners. That's not to put anyone down, but that's just to save yourself. Because what happens, sadly, you find people that never go to classes. They just learn from their phones or from their tablets. They talk about big issues. And those big issues, if you go to someone who's studied for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and you ask them, they say, I don't know, that's a difficult question. They can tell you what the guys found on Google, they can tell you that. But they understand that it's not that simple. You cannot just say something in the deen of Allah. There's consequences. There's consequences for what you say in the religion, in this dunya, and there's consequences in the akhirah. So don't think just because you go to someone who's got a grey beard and he's studied for a long time and he says it's not that simple, that he doesn't know. Don't be fooled by the confidence of the young person. And young means in age or maturity and knowledge. But maturity is what I was looking for. Because knowledge, alhamdulillah, people find it easy to find information. They'll quote you hadith. But maturity sometimes only comes when you go through things in life. When you end up not being able to live with people because you're making the deen too difficult. When you end up losing people that are loved to you because you make the deen too difficult. Then you start to mature and realize, wait, maybe I'm misunderstanding something. And you start to research more, you start to ask scholars, you start to listen to what scholars actually say, and then you realize that you're maybe a bit too enthusiastic. You're being a bit too tough. Yeah? Finally, this session inshallah will be the last session until after Ramadan.